Hello there. In this video, we're going to attempt to explain the navigation commands override within DockShell. So within DockShell, we have a number of core extension files. And these core extensions are basically areas that the developer can override behavior. So the out-of-the-box behavior with DockShell, essentially it takes a model-first approach or a model-first approach. And if we go and take a look at our model, for example, pull that up. Here we go. And what we mean by model first is let's pin that down. There we go. What we mean by model first is where we put the controls onto the model, and then at runtime, DockShell uses this generated metadata to build out the navigation layout and scaffolding itself. And so this extension here, this add navigation commands, is a virtual method that we can override. And what we've done is we've just basically taken the logic that's the underlying logic, and we've copied it up here so that you can see exactly how it's built. So we'll just zoom in a little bit here, and we'll just pin this back so we have a little more space and allows us to explain it. So you'll see here this add navigation commands. We pass in 3 parameters, the navigation container, this thing called a region identifier, and navigation group. This navigation group is actually a light switch, the actual light switch navigation group. So if we go back to our model, that's referring to this element here, this books in this case. Or administration or categories. So these are the navigation groups that we have in LightSwitch. And then these are the individual screens associated with that. Now the way LightSwitch works from a framework perspective is that it will not provide us any information whatsoever about the iNavigation group for books if in fact the user is not does not have access to any of the screens associated to that navigation group. So for example, in this example, there's only one screen called Books List Detail, but if I as a user did not have access to iBooks List Detail, and given that it's the only screen in this navigation group, then LightSwitch would not even tell DockShell that there is this thing called a Books navigation group. So given that, the only time we're going to get called in through this method here is when in fact we actually have that navigation group or the user has access to it. This region identifier is a concept within DockShell to correlate an instance of a control to an area within Prism. And there's a host of other properties associated to a region identifier. And you can look at those through reflection to kind of gauge and understand what those properties do. We won't get into too much detail into that. Suffice to say that this call that comes into here, this region identifier, if we go back to our model, it's actually going to be an instance of a tile view item, or it's going to be an instance of a ribbon tab. Or any type of navigation container control that you might have built. So go back to our here, and this navigation container, that really refers to this particular area here, which is, if we just pin that back a bit, you can see that that's a rad tile view control, or it is a rad ribbon view control, or whatever type of application navigation control you want to apply. So of course you can create your own. So that navigation container would be rad ribbon view or a tile view control. So the instance of it, if you will. Okay, and so once that call is made, and when this call is made, the idea is that we are processing these navigation groups, these light switch navigation groups. And again, only when the user has one or more screens would we even process that. And through metadata, we've already created an instance of this control. That's what that region identifier is, or in this case, the ribbon control itself. And so as we're processing that, what we want to do is we want to inject these light switch navigation commands. So if we go back to here, that's what's here. and here. And this one here, if you look at the logic here, we have this concept where rather than draw lines to prism regions, we have these named regions. So this one here is a navigation region that sits on the ribbon tab, and it's a very specific name. Has a very specific export name. Navigation region, screen navigation region. That's what it's called, or nav region. And so by doing that, this command, when it's set to true, is navigation container command. It's basically saying that this thing here will wire into this thing here automatically. So that, and you note that, scroll over, that this prism region is actually sitting right on the ribbon tab, whereas in this scenario here, we actually have it sitting on a view container. So it's kind of once removed from the tile view item, and because we have 3 separate states, we have to do it that way. So that'll become more apparent as we go through the logic now that we're in here. So we'll take a look at the logic. So at various points, just for diagnostics purposes, we actually spit out messages, log message. So you would see those, you'd be able to trap those if you put breakpoints on that. So what we're doing is we're just checking to make sure that we actually have valid arguments coming through. And we're also checking the navigation group itself, the light switch navigation group, to see if it has some children. And those are the navigation screens themselves. So if it doesn't have any, then we return. And that likely would never be the case because, as I say, we would never even create a group if we didn't have children associated to it. And then what we're doing here is we're just setting up some optimization lists to track what has and has not been processed. And once we have that, now what we're doing is we're ripping through each of the navigation screens. So if we go back to our model, what we're doing now is we're past this group, and we're ripping through one or more light switch screens. And what we're attempting to do is locate these endpoints, in other words, these DockShell commands, and create an instance of that command and inject it into these regions and or this named region down here. And so as we rip through each of the navigation screens themselves, we're going to call this get screen navigations command, or method rather, and it's going to come back with one or more navigation commands associated to that screen. So in this case here, if we were to go back to here, we would end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 commands, navigation commands that would be returned by this method here. The next thing we want to do then is we want to process each command in turn. And what we're doing is we are establishing if the navigation command actually has a view model associated to it and an export and a target region name. If it doesn't have a command associated to, a DockShell command view model or an export name, and it's not a good candidate, we won't process it. We'll simply continue in the loop. If it does, though, the first thing we want to do is we want to look at this instance, this item instance associated to this passed in region. So that, again, that region is the region that's passed in. And if we go back to our model, what we're looking at here is this thing here. And we're looking to see what type it is. And if it's of type DockShell Navigation Layout View Item Control, that's really a layout control as opposed to this tab control, where we actually have the regions sitting right on the tab control itself. This is a special layout control which has these view containers, and in this case here, there is a potential of up to 3 different states. We have a maximum, a minimum, and a restore, which is actually a term that's derived from the Telerik controls. This is that normal state, so max, min, and normal. So if the control instance, the item instance associated to that particular region identifier, is a type DockShell Navigation View Item Control, then we fall into this loop here. And the next thing we're doing is we're establishing that it actually has layouts, layout view item details. In other words, it's highly possible that the developer has deleted one of these or all of these, and if he has, then we wouldn't actually be able to process them. So that's what we're checking there. And then because there are 3 states, we are looking at these 3 states in particular. We're looking to cast over each of the identifiers themselves. You can see here to get the max, the min, and what we're really getting here is the region identifier is, if we go back to our model, these view containers. So in essence, at this point, these are already pre-built for us by the DockShell framework, and so these view containers are being passed in, being checked here. And what we're doing at this point is we're now calling this insert navigation commands into this region, and we're passing in the, so this is the view container instance, and this is the navigation command itself. And this is just basically ensuring that we don't process it more than once, and this is for licensing purposes logic. So if we just really concentrate on these 3 values here, you can see that it's going to call this insert navigation commands into the maximum, the minimum, and the normal state or view containers. However, if it is not a layout control, then it's handled a little differently. The region identifier, which is the region identifier that is passed in into this method, is in fact the target. In other words, this would be, in this case here, so this would be the region identifier if it was a layout control. But of course, if it's not a layout control, it's basically saying that the region is going to be sitting right on the control itself. So that's basically the reason for the layout control check. All right, so we've copied the private method here for insert navigations into regions. So let's take a look at that. So once again, we are now either a view container for a layout control, or we're actually a ribbon tab in this scenario. And we have a navigation command that's coming in. And so what we're doing is we come down and we're checking to ensure that the target region name associated to that command. So the target region name, if I just go back to here, refers to the endpoint of this link. So it's actually ensuring that there is in fact a target associated to that, because you could have the command defined in your model, but you might not have it targeting anything. And so it's just checking to make sure that there is a region identifier. So in other words, the region identifier that we're passing through, which could be a view container or it could be a ribbon tab, actually has a region by the name of the target region of the command itself. If that's not the case, then it simply returns. And then we are checking to see if the navigation command itself is not null. In other words, it's already established, it's already been created. And if that's the case, what we're doing is we're checking to see if we've already processed it. And if we have, we just simply return. If we haven't, we add it to the process list. And then this logic here is very similar to down below, which we'll look at in a second. What we're doing is we're taking the navigation command and we're setting the region identifier to it. So in this case, this navigation command, if we go back to here, is looking at this particular scenario here. And the region identifier would be this ribbon tab. So we're setting the ribbon tab to these navigation commands. DockShell, where was I? Sorry. Right here. We are setting the view model associated to that navigation command's region identifier equal to the region identifier that's passed in. No, that sounds confusing, but bear with me. It may make a bit more sense as we go through this. And then we look at the command item itself. In the command item, this is where we're actually creating an instance of the actual DockShell command itself. So in this case here, the export that we give it, which would be, in the case of the tile view, it's a hyperlink command. So the actual name at this point would be hyperlink command, and we are then casting that to be a framework element. So this is how we use MEF. We leverage MEF to create an instance of a particular control within DockShell. And once we have that command item, then we do a bit more work where we set the actual data context of that new command equal to the view model of the navigation command. So the reason that this is done, it looks kind of quirky, the reason this is done is that this is already pre-created for us. So we have this concept up here, right here, where this control is actually pre-created for us. And whoops, that's this navigation control. And what we're doing is we're creating instances of these items here so that we can inject them into these regions here or here, depending on the type of region that's being passed in. So that view model is going to be identical. No matter what type of control we just created, our backing view model is going to be one and the same, because when the user hits that button, whether it's a link on that tile view or whether it's a ribbon button on the ribbon tab, we want the overall action to be exactly the same. So that's what's happening here. This quirky little bit of line here is basically setting the view model, and this just so that binding is actually we create a set of binding events. The name itself is established from the this key name, which is again predefined or pre-created for us with the command item and then a count. So we can look at that at runtime when we debug this to see what that looks like. And here's a bit of magic. It's not really magic, but this is where we're now using Prism to say, take this new command that we just created, this new hyperlink control or whatever, and inject it into this target region. Now this target region has to be associated to this region manager itself. So in Prism, region managers and named regions within those region managers have to be unique. And so what DockShell does is it ensures that areas are unique by creating what we call, or what Prism calls, scoped regions. And all of that's already done for you at this point. By the time it gets to this point here, it is going to be adding it to a specific region manager and to a specific, adding to a specific region by this name, which is the name that is established from linking this particular item here to this particular region and or this region down here, if it's a named region. So in fact, that's what we're looking at here. This is the name region. So if we get to this point here and we don't have that command, it goes down and it says, okay, let's get a collection of Prism regions, and let's base that collection of Prism regions, or determine that set of Prism regions on looking at some of the metadata. So there's this logic in here is looking to get the control ID off of the region identifier. So if this region identifier, for example, is a layout control, this ID would be set, and therefore we would have this base control would come back, and from that base control we can get the Prism regions associated to that control. So I wouldn't worry too much about this, other than the fact to say that at the end of the day, we're going to end up with these regions here, if this is maximum or normal or minimum. So we'll end up with 3 regions here. And then what we're doing is we are enumerating those regions, and essentially what we're trying to figure out is this Prism region actually targeted by this navigation control command? So in other words, has the user drawn a link from here to here? So at this point, what we're doing is we're looking through each one of these regions to see if the command that we're processing, this navigation command that we're processing, is actually referenced or linked into it. And if it is, and it has not yet been processed, again, we check to make sure that we're not processing more than once. We simply make the add to the process list that we are processed, and set up our, basically link up our region identifiers on our command itself. And then what we're doing is we are creating a, just similar to above, we're creating a specific command. So I should really point out that that first one that we are looking at here would likely have created a ribbon command or ribbon button. when we created that command up here, which is right here. So that's probably a ribbon button. Whereas down here, because we're injecting into Prism regions, and likely a layout control, but not necessarily a hyperlink control, more probably is a hyperlink control. So that's what that export name would be. This would be hyperlink command. If we go back to our model, that would be coming from our properties. In particular, it would be coming from the export name hyperlink command. So this is really just looking in your project for DockShell commands, and there's in this case 3 out of the box in the provider. You can create your own commands, and that text name or that export name is what is being passed in right here, and is how we're getting the how we're creating the command item itself. Now we cast it to a framework item element because we want to just use it as a framework element as far as setting the data context and its name, which is the only 2 things that we really do to the commands themselves. Is set the backing view model again to be that same backing view model, so it's always the same backing view model, and then the name itself is just something that's unique that we establish as being unique. And you can see here it's the same thing. We're adding it to a region. The target region in this case here would be the Prism region itself, right? So let's take a look at how this works at runtime. So what we'll do is we'll just put this breakpoint on here and let's run it. So as it's loading up, LightSwitch is going to tell DockShell, this user has access to this navigation group, and we're going to try building out the navigation groups first, followed by adding the navigation commands based on the LightSwitch screens that the user has access to. And again, that comes from that iNavigation group, which is a LightSwitch interface. And here we go. So we're now starting to add the commands, add navigation commands. So if we look here, we can take a look at our navigation container, and you can see that this navigation container is actually the dashboard. So that's the first navigation, that's that tile view control. And if we look at our region identifier, you can see that it's the navigation control books, application navigation view layout control. And that is actually, if we were to look at our model, that's referring to this guy right here, this tile. And if we look at our, scrolling across, if we look at our navigation group, so the navigation group that we're enumerating right now is actually, it's tasks is the description, but books is the display name. I renamed it. It was, by default, tasks is your first navigation group in LightSwitch, and then I renamed it to books, and that's why it's still called tasks, but it's displayed as books. And so we are now processing the books navigation group and all the navigation commands associated to that particular LightSwitch group. And so we'll just step that through. And let's see, we have one screen that the user has access to. There's only one on that particular navigation group called Books List Detail. Again, I wouldn't have access to that if I didn't. I wouldn't see that if I didn't have permissions to that screen. So that wouldn't actually show. And again, that's something that LightSwitch builds out for us. So now we're going to rip through each of the screens. In this case, there's only one, and we're going to get the navigation commands associated to that screen. If we look at that, you can see that there's actually 3 commands that are associated to that: a hyperlink, a hyperlink, a hyperlink command. And you may be wondering, well, where's the other one? It'll come later in a subsequent call. Because right now what we're doing is we're actually processing this guy here, the tile item. And so you'll notice here that when we called this get commands, it passed in the region identifier. So it knows from this, hey, only return the commands associated to the tile view item. And that's what it's got here. So it's got all the commands themselves. So if we just quickly step through, you can see that first thing it's going to determine that this is in fact a layout control, the tile view layout control. And it's going to say, do I have a maximum view state? I do. In this case, it is a view container. So if you look at that, you can see that it is a view container control. And that is actually, if we look at our model, this particular element right here. So, and that, if you recall, is a tile 1 norm, or max in this case. So if we look at this guy here, and we look at, you can see that it's a, oops, let's do it again, tile 1 maximum. It's got its appropriate view model and so forth. And now what we're doing is we're calling insert navigation commands into the region. And you'll notice that it's determined that it's not a ribbon tab where it's got the region right on the control itself. It's actually extended out. It knows now that it has a collection of regions, and if we look at that regions list, you can see that there's 3 of them, and they're pretty funky names. These unique GUIDs are automatically created for us if in fact we don't put a name. So if I go back to my view container here, you'll notice here that I do not have a name on. Oops, we're actually talking about the regions. Same thing applies to any control. If you don't put a unique name on here, when the T4 templates are generated, it automatically creates unique names. But if we look at this prism region, for example, you'll notice that the name is also blank, and therefore that's why we're seeing that that auto-generated GUID for us. If we put a name in here, it does have to be unique across the application, just so so that you know. Otherwise, when it gets generated, the name itself and the metadata has to be unique. And if it's not, you'll get a compile time error. So if you'll know that you've made a mistake if you get an error at compile. So if we go back to our code here, these regions here are actually 1, 2, 3, referring to these regions here. 1, 2, 3. In fact, I think this is the maximum. So it's yes, that's the maximum. So it's this region, and this region. And as we go through this logic, you can see that F10. There we go. It's just checking to make sure that we have all the underlying basic stuff that we need there in play. And then it's enumerating each of those prism regions. And so what it's doing now is it's looking to see, am I targeted as is this as an individual prism region, am I being targeted by this particular navigation command? And in this case, I am. And so it's checking to see if we've already processed it. In this case, we have not, so we'll add it to the process list. And this region identifier is basically saying, hey, we want to make sure that the region identifier for this particular view model is the same region identifier. For this navigation command is the same region identifier. And so if we just step that through a little bit, you can see here this is where we're actually creating the instance of a hyperlink command. And if I just do F10, if you look at this particular created instance, now this was created by MEF based on that export name, and you can see we have this hyperlink command. And if I drill into it, you can see it's got that command itself is there. So now if we step through this, just set up a few more things. You can see that the data context now is set to the same view model as the navigation command. So that allows us to basically clone commands is what it's doing here. So the backing view model is going to be the same on this new command, just as I explained before. And this just ensures that there's some binding events that fire by referencing itself. And then we create this unique name. So now you can see that it's a view container control underscore maximize view container underscore books command item 0. And this is in fact where it's adding the actual hyperlink command to this thing called commands list on this region manager. So the region manager actually has a set of regions. And so there's 3 regions, and the first one's called a screen target 2. The next one is called screen target 1, and then it's a commands list. And those regions are actually referring to, if we go back to our model here, they're referring to these prism regions here. So basically what we're doing right by calling this add to region and passing in this new command is we're injecting that at that point. Now it's now been injected into the prism region. So the command was created and then added into that UI area. So essentially that's how it works, how it's processing it, model first approach. And obviously I'll just let that run. And we'll take that breakpoint off and let it continue. And you can see that, so this link here, this books link, is a navigation command of type hyperlink. That's how it was modeled. And when pressed, it will open up the navigation, or sorry, the books list detail screen. And this button up here is actually a navigation command that was injected into the ribbon tab. So now you know the underlying sort of concept there. So of course, what we want is when I press this button, we want the same action to occur. So that's why that backing view model is one and the same. So it's there. So basically, we create those. DockShell creates those in advance and allows you to kind of clone them out and put them anywhere. And so pretty much, you know, if you were to, for instance, create, there's other videos where you can create shortcuts and whatnot, and you're actually wiring those same commands to say context menu, which we don't have in this particular demo, but it's the same concept where those navigation commands are injected into those context menus. So that's in fact how that works. And then I guess if you were to kind of do this on your own without the model, in other words, you would maybe in your model, what you want to do is you might have some special kind of region that you want to just automatically create commands and push commands into. You would not create this thing this way. You would not create a hyperlink command in the model. So in other words, you would just simply delete that. And at runtime, what you would do is you would look to see, okay, I've got this command here. And sorry, at runtime, what you would do is you would get that, you would still get this command bubble up, this one here, would still come up, and then you could automatically create those hyperlink commands. So what you could do, if it's hyperlink that you're creating, for instance, is instead of, we go back to our code here, right down where we create the command right here. So instead of it, like, you know, being something that you get from the model, you would say hyperlink command kind of thing. And that'll automatically create a hyperlink command. And you'd have like Bruce's command as an example. Whatever specialty command that you have, you define that in your either in your LightSwitch project or in your provider project, and then just give it a unique export name, and that's how you can create it on the fly. So the two keys to creating controls in DockShell is to create it by a known interface and by a known export name, and that'll automatically, that one line right there will automatically create that instance for you. And then you just have to make sure that in this case here that you follow the same sort of rules of engagement where you take this navigation commands backing view model, set it to the data context, set the name, and add it to the region just as we're doing here. And the region here, again, you could, you know, you don't have to use that region. You can say put it into some known region that you've created. So as long as you've got something that's called some known region, it'll automatically put that command item into that region at runtime. Great. And that's basically how DockShell works. The whole DockShell, I guess the whole UI starts with one region, one named region, and then what we do is and we'll just not save that, you know, and then what we do at runtime is we look for a shell, and so whatever your shell is, we create an instance of that shell and we inject it into that single region. And truth be known, there's actually a screen, splash screen. So there's actually two regions there. So if you add a splash screen to the shell, we know to take the splash screen and stick it in there. But the point is that it starts with nothing and it composes dynamically based on how you've modeled it. And at all points within the composition process, whether it's in build up or tear down, there are extensibility points, as I've pointed out, where you can add your own code, and so forth. And in this case here, what I was referring to, you would um, basically what you would have done is you would have just done called the base method and then done whatever else tests you want to do to inject specific commands into named regions. So in summary, you do need to, if you're going to do that kind of stuff, you're going to have to give your Prism regions some names and make them unique. And that same on your tiles, give it a name and make it unique. And that way it's easy within your code to be able to identify those controls as the logic is processing them and calling these, add navigation commands. You have the ability to intercept those and do whatever logic you want to do, or insert whatever command you want to do, or control the behavior in any which way you want. Okay, so that's how it works. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it's a lot to digest, but that's how DockShell works, and that's how it's wired together all the way through. Every aspect and every control, same way. So once you understand that piece, you pretty much understand how to take advantage of all the other points of extensibility. I hope you have a good day. Thank you very much.